Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the question of chronology in our study of New Testament backgrounds. First of all, I want to talk about the climate of ancient Canaan. The climate's the same today, so Canaan, whether back then or even today. You have a rainy season. Those are in the winter months, beginning probably around October, where you have what you call the early rains. And you might have some sprinkling in October, gets a bit more in November. December, January, February, that's the rainy season. By March, it starts dying out. April, you might have a little bit, and by May, you've now entered the dry season. And from May to the next October, it is going to be dry. And that's your summer season. Notice late spring, early fall. That's the summer season, and that's the dry season of Canaan. Now, our calendar, notice I've got the English months over on the left-hand side. We have months like September, October, November, December. They have Latin names, and so the Latin for September is septem, which just means 7. Or an octagon, for example, is 8. A decimal system is the 10th. So notice our months, September, October, November, December, literally mean 7, 8, 9, and 10. You say, wait a minute, I thought December was the 12th month. Well, not for ancient Rome, and also not for very early Israel. Their year would begin in the springtime around March. And so that's true of both early Israel, their religious calendar. Later on, they would adapt the Babylonian calendar, but I'm not counting that. But also Rome, early on, had different orientation for the time the calendar began. Now, when we're speaking of the Jewish people, there's a difference, I just said, between the religious calendar, and when I say religious, I mean also the biblical calendar, versus the non-biblical calendar, in other words, the civil calendar. Once the Jews had gone to Babylon in the Babylonian captivity, they came back and eventually began adopting a Babylonian calendar, where if you look at a Jewish calendar today, you'll have Rosh Hashanah. That's the New Year, literally means head of the year. That's the Jewish New Year, but that's around August, September, that time of the year. The biblical Jewish year never started at that time. That's the civil calendar that they borrowed from their Babylonian counterparts. And so in the religious year, the biblical year, the one that's described in Leviticus chapter 23, the year begins in the spring. For the civil year, that begins in the fall, and that was adopted at a later time. Never mentioned in the Bible. The Bible never uses the civil calendar. The Bible does refer to 7 feasts. Now, eventually there would be others, but these would be the ones that would be mentioned in the book of Leviticus. First, you have the Passover, commemorates the deliverance from Egypt, and that kicks off an entire week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where they would remove from their homes all of the leaven, and it represented the removal of impurities from the old life. Then you would go to the very first day of the week after Passover. It could be the next day, it could be a few days later. The first day of the week after Passover, you would have the Feast of the First Fruits, where you would remember you're right at the end of the harvest season, the end of the rainy season, and so you bring the very first fruits of the crops and you wave them before the Lord. And it's a promise of more crops to come, a promise of new life to come. It just happens to be that Jesus was raised from the dead on the day of first fruits, the first day of the week after Passover. Next, you count 50 days, and I'm still sort of clumping this with spring feasts, although you might argue, well, this is summertime by now. But you count 50 days after that Feast of First Fruits, and now you come to Pentecost. And we think of that as the giving of the Holy Spirit. They would have thought of that back in New Testament times as the giving of the law. That's what they remembered, the giving of the Mosaic covenant, and they equated those two together. Next, there's a long break, and the next ones that are mentioned in the Bible, first you have the Feast of Trumpets. That would become the civil New Year. It marked the beginning of the month, really, of the next 2 feasts that would come. Then would be Yom Kippur, we call it that, but that's the Day of Atonement, and that would be the atonement, the atoning sacrifice made for the entire nation. Back in Old Testament times, that's when the high priest would go into the holy place and sprinkle blood upon the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. By the time we get to the New Testament, the Ark of the Covenant's not there anymore. That had been lost during the days of Babylon. But the high priest still goes in to the Holy of Holies and would sprinkle blood on the place where the Ark of the Covenant used to be, but it wasn't there anymore. Next, we have the Feast of Booths, also called the Feast of Tabernacles, where for a week the Israelites would move out of their homes and they would camp out. They would dwell in temporary dwellings to remember that time when they had no homes, and also remember how God himself dwelt in a tent with them. And so there's this idea of God dwelling with his people. And they would read the book of Ecclesiastes, which talks about how we live in sort of a temporary dwelling. These bodies of ours are only temporary, and we're here today and gone tomorrow. And so they would read the book of Ecclesiastes during that time. Now, here's the same calendar, although I've given you all the months. We're not going to go through each one, but notice there are a few extra feasts. There's on the first month, which corresponds to our March, a little bit of April perhaps, the end of the rainy season, Passover and first fruits, and the week of unleavened bread. And then notice on the third month, corresponding to our May and June, you have Pentecost. But then we've added several more feasts. We have on the fifth month, the 9th of Av would be the commemoration of the fall of the temple, the destruction of the temple, and at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. As it turned out, when the temple was destroyed again in 70 A.D., it was destroyed on exactly the same day, although hundreds of years later. And so the fall of Jerusalem, and that's right in the middle of the dry season. We get to the 7th month, the month of Tishri, and there we have Yom Kippur and the Feast of Booths. And those are the ones that are mentioned in Leviticus. Then we get to the 9th month, corresponding to our November and December, and we have the festival of Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, or we could call it rededication, because it commemorated the recapturing of the temple after it had been taken and polluted by pagans, and now it was devoted back to God, and it was dedicated back to him, and it was cleansed, and that's celebrated to this day. The final observance is in the month of Adar, the last month of the year, right at the end of the religious year, and that is the festival of Purim, describing and remembering the events of the book of Esther. We have this period, and we've already talked about it, so I'm going to just mention it very briefly. From 400 BC to 4 BC, sometimes we call this the 400 silent years. And it's not that God had gone on vacation, but we don't have any scriptures being written during this period. Now, we do have books that we know today as the Apocrypha. Some of these were written, in fact, most of these were written during this period. But we have from the end of Malachi, the Persian Empire, finally comes to a close in 331, where Alexander conquers the Persian Empire. And for the Jews, this means that you have the Greek kings ruling Egypt, or the Ptolemies ruling Syria, and other points beyond are the Seleucids. But with the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC, the Jewish people now regain their freedom, and you have their leaders, that house of Hashmon, the Hasmoneans, initially known as the Maccabees, just as a what do you call that? When somebody has a nickname, that was they were nicknamed that, but they were the Hasmoneans, and they're actually going to rule all the way up until Rome comes under the hand of Pompey the Great. He conquers Jerusalem in 63 BC, and from now on, Israel is now a series of Roman provinces that will eventually be overseen by Herod the Great, and then Herod's going to die in 4 BC, and that takes us into the New Testament era. Now, the calendar that we use went through this big change. Back in New Testament times, they would use the Old Roman from the year of the founding. They thought of that. And you say it in Latin instead. And Rome was founded in the year what we call 753 BC. And so somebody said it was one of the popes, Pope John I, 525 AD, suggested, and he commissioned a means of changing the calendar. Already they were using the old Roman system from the founding of the city of Rome. They had also begun to use the reign of Diocletian, of saying, well, we'll make that year one, but that didn't really take long term. And so he said, let's make the birth of Jesus the beginning point. And they were aiming to they believed that Jesus was born in the year 754 AUC, that is from the founding of the city of Rome. They missed it by several years, so that we normally, because Herod the Great, by our reckoning, died around 4 BC. Like I said, they missed it by a few years. They meant well, which means that Jesus probably would have been born either that year or maybe the year before, maybe a little bit. We're not sure exactly when. I'm going to suggest around the end of 5 BC, early 4 BC for the birth of Jesus. The death of Herod, as we said, takes place in 4 BC. Josephus has described his reign beginning in 4 BC. Of course, he doesn't use those numbers; they hadn't been invented yet. But what counts to us is 40 BC. It's not until 37 that he finally makes it back and retakes Israel, because they had been in a state of rebellion, and then he reigns all those years up until 4 BC. And near his death, Josephus mentions a lunar eclipse just prior to his death, which helps us to pinpoint exactly when this took place. Now, Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 give us some other details as to the timing of the birth of Jesus. First of all, it starts off, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. So it's going to be during the reign of Caesar Augustus, but verse 2 says this was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and that is meant to pin it down even more carefully. The Census of Augustus, of course, that's Gaius Octavius Augustus. He's gone by a bunch of different names. He actually changed his name to Gaius Julius Caesar after his adopted father, but we don't call him that because that would be way too confusing. It was of him who he had said, I found Rome brick, I left her marble, and the way he paid for that was these taxations brought about by the census that were given, such as the one that's described here. It's during his period that you have the Pax Romana. You have a great peace that's under the, not total peace, but compared to the period before this and compared to the period after this, there's a period of relative peace during this part of history. Now, some problems with the census and regulating our date to that census. First of all, Quirinius was governor of Syria from 6 to 7 AD, which is far too late if Jesus was born during the lifetime of Herod the Great. That's far too late for the birth of Jesus. There is no earlier recorded census, but that doesn't mean our records are all that full. There are certainly gaps in our records. There's no known census while Quirinius was governor, so that while he was governor from 6 to 7, there's no census that we know about during that period either. And so in any case, our records are insufficient. Some proposed solutions to this. It has been suggested that the passage can be translated in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, that this census was taken before Quirinius was governor of Syria. That's not a good translation, and that's a little forced. I suppose you could make it do that. I don't think we have to go in that direction. A second proposal is that the translation be meant that this census was before that which Quirinius was governor of Syria. Again, you can sort of push the words to say that, but that's not its natural reading, and most translations haven't translated it that way because that's not the natural reading. Thirdly, the term that Luke uses is a general one. He says that this was the first, he says specifically, this was the first census taken while Quirinius was governing Assyria. Well, you say, isn't the governor governing? Well, sort of, except that remember that Luke uses those terms in a more general sense. He might describe somebody as a governor when actually their official title is a praetor or maybe a procurator or something like that. And so he gives them the title that everybody would use instead of what might actually be the technical title. He's not trying to give us a technical dissertation on the different titles and so on. So it could be that he's referring to Quirinius doing something earlier in history, and we're going to point out that Quirinius was in Syria, commanding legions and so on, at an earlier date. The Lapis Tiburtinus is a tombstone that was found, records the achievements of an unknown governor who served as propraetor of Syria twice. And we don't know anyone that did that. There's no record of any governor of Syria having served twice. And that means maybe our records are incomplete. Our records aren't as exact as this tombstone. And so it might be that Quirinius did serve, not only that he served in the area, because we know that he commanded legions in Syria after 12 BC, but that he might have actually held the title. And that portion of the record is missing for us. Next we have Luke chapter 3 verse 1 speaking about the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, and he says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius is the one he's the Caesar who came after Octavius Augustus. When he came to power, you say, well, which year was that? In 12 AD, Octavius Augustus was getting a little bit old and a little bit frail, and so he had Tiberius take up a joint rulership with him. And then in 14 AD, after Octavius died, then Tiberius moved easily into the position because he was already in the position. Now he was just reigning by himself. So the question is, this date, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, is that marking it from the 12 AD or from the 14 AD date? Which date is being used? The ministry of John the Baptist from this passage started on the 15th year of Tiberius. If we take that to be from the first year that Tiberius was sole ruler, then that begins the ministry of Jesus at 29 AD with his baptism around that time. However, if instead we are taking that to be the first year that he was in office, even though he was there as co-regent with Octavius, then that moves it up by 2 years, putting the baptism of Jesus at 27 AD. We also have the reference that Jesus was about 30 years old when he was baptized. And this works probably better with the second of these options, having a beginning of the ministry of Jesus 27 AD, if Jesus is born 4 BC. Remember, there's no year 0. We go from 1 BC right to 1 AD. But around 4 BC, was it a year earlier than that? We don't know exactly about when the birth of Jesus was. Next, we have the words of the Jews speaking to Jesus as he's in the temple, John chapter 2, verses 19 and 20, where Jesus says, destroy this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up. And they retort, this temple has been 46 years in the making. Now, according to Josephus, the rebuilding of the temple had started by Herod the Great in the 18th year of Herod. Of course, you have to ask, which 18th year, because remember, was it the 18th year from the time when he was declared to be king of the Jews, or when he came back and actually took over? But assuming that it's from the time he actually comes back and takes over, then that puts that year around between 20 to 19 BC for the beginning of that. And that would put the instance of John chapter 2, verse 20 taking place around 29 AD, again, give or take a year. We're all of these are putting us in the neighborhood of around 27, 28, 29 AD within that arena. Next, we have some Passovers that are mentioned in the ministry of Jesus. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke only mention the Passover that takes place at his death. But John mentions additional Passovers. There's a Passover of the cleansing of the temple in John chapter 2. There's an unnamed feast in John chapter 5, which may or may not have been a Passover. John chapter 6 and verse 4, again, there's a Passover when Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And finally, there's that last one that are mentioned in the Synoptics, where Jesus is arrested and crucified on the Passover, which means there's 3, maybe 4 Passovers, and that tells you how long is the ministry of Jesus, 2 plus, maybe 3 plus years, at least. Now, there could be other things that aren't mentioned, but I have the ministry of Jesus, based on John's Gospel, taking place over several years, not just within a single year. This brings up the question, on what day did Jesus die? Several days have been proposed: Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. For Wednesday, Matthew chapter 12, verse 40 speaks of 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, and that is said to mandate 3 full 24-hour periods. The problem with that is that regularly the scriptures use that phrase, 3 days and 3 nights, for periods that are any portion of a day, any portion of a night, are said to include that. And we can find that in the Old Testament. We can find that other places in the New Testament. That's pretty consistent. There are some who have said, well, maybe he was crucified on Thursday, and of course, to say it's Wednesday, you actually have to have Jesus rising on Saturday night, not on Sunday morning. Not too many people hold to that view. The Thursday view takes Matthew chapter 12, verse 40, referring to 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, and mandates at least a portion of a day, a portion of a night, both. The traditional view has been to say that he, and this is why we talk about Good Friday instead of Good Thursday, has been that he was crucified on a Friday. He was raised on the 3rd day, and the scriptures consistently state that he was raised upon the 3rd day. Luke chapter 24, 1 Corinthians 15, Acts 10, Matthew 27, all state that he was raised on the 3rd day. And he spoke, like I said, the Jews spoke of 3 days and 3 nights as any portion of either portion of those. So it could be just a portion of the night, a portion of the day, and that would still count as that, as that phrase, 3 days and 3 nights, especially when it's being used in a symbolic sort of way, as you find in Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. It's linking it up to what happened to Jonah. Now, both of the views of Wednesday and Thursday hinge upon a literal reading of that single verse, Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. If we don't take that with rigid literalism, we have no problem with the Friday crucifixion, which is supported throughout everything else in the New Testament. Both the views, the Wednesday and the Thursday view, reinterpret any mention of the Sabbath day, because it goes on to say the next day was a Sabbath. And so that's what's commonly said was, well, that was just a special Sabbath. In other words, that was a Passover, but not the regular Sabbath. The problem is the scriptures don't normally refer to that as a Sabbath. When they want to talk about the Passover, they'll talk about the Passover. And the Gospels do that. And Matthew chapter 27, verse 62 is quite specific to say Jesus was taken down from the cross just prior to the Sabbath. And so that really works better. The Wednesday view is held by Scroggie, who, on the other hand, says the embalming took place on Friday. Now, I think it was the Seventh-day Adventists that have also opted for that Wednesday view. I'm not sure why it makes a difference for them, except that remember that their whole denomination came about in an attempt to pin down exactly when Jesus was coming back, and it was very oriented toward this day, that day, or the other day, and even the day in which they meet to worship, they take to be a very important issue. The Thursday view was held by Westcott. The Friday view has been held by Honer, who wrote his book on the chronology of the New Testament. MacArthur, Hendrickson, a number of others have adopted that Friday view. It has been suggested and fought over, but as far as I can tell, this chart is reasonably correct, showing on what day of the week the 14th of Nisan, that Jewish month, took place on those years from 28 to 34 AD. Notice that a number of these don't qualify in any way, shape, or form for those to be Passover. But in 30 AD and again in 33 AD, on both of those, Friday worked as Passover. And it just so happens in 33 AD that also around that time of Passover, there was a partial lunar eclipse. So you could actually look and say there's a sense in which not only was the sun darkened, but the moon became red. In other words, the moon turned to blood. And that might be a point in understanding Jesus to have been crucified in 33 AD.